George Washington was many things. A founding father, the first United States president, the commander of the Continental Army during the American Revolution, and a British assassin responsible for starting a multi-continental war over control of Ohio? That might sound like the tagline of a cheesy alternate history novel that you shove aside in search of something more believable, but depending on who you ask, it may actually have the tiniest bit of truth to it. Washington wasn't an assassin in the traditional sense, but in his youth, he was the commanding officer during a battle where a surrendering French official was killed through what many at the time considered to be dishonorable means. If you think that this is simply too unbelievable to be true, you should know that Washington actually signed a document himself admitting to it. This confession was not written directly by his hand, nor was it in a language that he could read, but he still signed it, and that had major consequences. Until his dying day, Washington maintained that his translator at the time had lied to him, and as a result, he was not aware of what he was signing. But whether or not that part is true doesn't change the fact that that little piece of paper would go on to play a significant role in world politics. In fact, some historians credit it for being one of the main justifications of a war that would not only change lines on a map, but also bring the largest European powers to one another's throats. Once again, alliances would be forged and broken, generals would rise and resign in disgrace, countries would see thousands of miles of territory exchange hands. And if all of that wasn't enough, it would also set the stage for the founding of the United States and introduce some of its most well-known names. As a whole, this global conflict would come to be known as the 7 Years' War. But it is the battles that were fought in North America that we're going to be focusing on in today's video. A conflict that is known as the French and Indian War. And yes, I did say that this all started over a disagreement involving Ohio. Today, the United Kingdom and France are as allied as any two separate countries can be, and war between them seems almost unimaginable. However, there was a time not so long ago when the two were the bitterest of enemies. For centuries, war had been waged over everything from territorial disputes to religious doctrine, and even in times of relative peace, small skirmishes were more than common. At this point in history, when colonialism was quickly becoming as popular as powdered wigs and tea, the two were once again beginning to butt heads. This time, it was over their new prized possession, the Americas. By then, both countries had settled in the New World and had spent over a century attempting to secure as much land for themselves as possible. The French controlled parts of modern-day Canada, primarily New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, as well as parts of Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama. The British, on the other hand, had their prized 13 colonies along the United States' eastern seaboard. All the areas in between these two colonial powerhouses were controlled by numerous Native American tribes scattered throughout, although for the colonials these lands might as well have been uninhabited, as the Native American presence was often seen as just a minor side note for their future plans. One of those hotly contested in-between lands was what is now modern-day Ohio. Centuries before it would be known for the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and boring suburban afternoons, Ohio was known as Ohio County, and it consisted of the entirety of modern-day Ohio, as well as parts of Indiana, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia. For the French, this area was a valuable trade route that connected their colonies in modern-day Canada to the ones in and around Louisiana, and for the British, it was seen as the best route to access any and all lands west of the original 13 colonies. To complicate things, both sides felt that they had a legitimate claim to the area, and in the mid-1750s, they were beginning to press those claims. The French colonies based theirs on the explorations of René Robert Cavelier, Sieur de La Salle, who had traveled up the Mississippi, claiming all of the lands that surrounded it as well as any of its tributaries. For those of you unfamiliar with the size and location of the Mississippi River, it is the 13th largest river in the world and stretches 2,340 miles from the Gulf of Mexico all the way north to the Great Lakes. The river touches 13 of the 50 modern American states, and its tributaries cross 32 of them. While this may seem to be quite a silly claim by the French, the British were certainly no less ambitious. In the early 17th century, an English royal charter, based off the explorations of John Cabot, had granted all lands in between the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans, as well as north of Spanish-controlled Florida, to their own colonies. This claim would have given control of roughly 85% of the modern United States to Britain. After these obviously conflicting claims were formalized, it became only a matter of time before the two would once again have to settle the dispute the only way they knew how: with war. The first real sign of the problems to come was when the Governor-General of New France, Marquis de Caen, dispatched Captain Pierre-Joseph Céloron de Blainville to an area south of the Great Lakes. De Caen's orders were to rid the area of British settlers and traders. When the captain arrived, he demanded that they lower their flags and leave the area. But when they did not immediately comply, he began taking much harsher actions against them. In 1752, the captain marched his forces into the British trading post located in Albany and destroyed it. The French soldiers then proceeded to capture or kill any English-speaking traders that they could find anywhere along the Ohio River. In response to this obvious escalation, Virginia's Lieutenant Governor, Robert Dinwiddie, began searching for a representative who could travel the distance into Pennsylvania and order the French out of the area. The man he chose was none other than the 21-year-old 6'2" Major George Washington. Washington was the obvious choice, as not only was he a military man from a well-connected and influential family, but he had also spent a considerable amount of time working as a land surveyor in the Ohio River Valley. Years earlier, in order to encourage settlement of the Ohio country, the Ohio Company was founded and granted over 200,000 acres of land between the Kanawha and the Monongahela rivers. Washington's family, as well as the families of Governor Dinwiddie and several other prominent Virginians, were shareholders in the Ohio Company and had a significant financial interest in securing the lands on which the French were now encroaching. Washington was ordered to deliver a simple message to the French: leave the area and stop harassing the English settlers. So, in 1753, Washington, along with his friend Jacob Van Bram and a French translator employed by the Ohio Company, Christopher Gist, set out to speak with Captain Legardeur de Saint-Pierre. 2 months later, in December, they arrived and delivered the message, but it was ill-received. Thankfully for the future United States president, the captain did not feel the need to shoot the messenger, and Washington was permitted to leave with a reply for his governor. It stated that France's claim was incontestable and far superior. Washington delivered the message to Governor Dinwiddie, who was disappointed, although probably not exactly surprised by the Frenchman's response. Unwilling to back down, Dinwiddie ordered the construction of a fort where the Allegheny and the Monongahela rivers converged. This would be modern-day Pittsburgh. On March the 15th of the following year, he dispatched Washington and 160 men under the control of Colonel Joshua Fry to reinforce the troops who had already begun building the fort. However, before Fry and his men could arrive or the fort could be completed, French troops overwhelmed and occupied the land on which it stood. They took the fort, completed it, and renamed it Fort Duquesne. As Colonel Fry landed on his neck after being thrown from the back of his horse, he died shortly after from injury, and the young and experienced George Washington suddenly found himself thrust into a position of leadership. When he learns of the French's newly completed fort, Washington moved his men 40 miles south to an area known as the Great Meadows and ordered the construction of his own fort, which he cheekily called Fort Necessity. It was a small, hastily erected structure that was barely more than a one-room shack surrounded by a log palisade. But Washington felt it would be sufficient for simple defensive purposes until reinforcements could arrive from Virginia. It was at this time, while Washington and his men were anxiously awaiting those reinforcements, that a Native American leader known to the British as Half King, whose real name was Tannack Harrison, approached Washington and warned him that 35 French troops were moving south toward Fort Necessity. Tannack Harrison urged Washington desperately to strike first and offered the support of his small group of men if he were to agree. After much deliberation, Washington did, and he, along with 40 of his men and a dozen of Tannack Harrison's men, began traveling north to intercept the French troops. On the morning of May the 28th, 1754, the two groups made contact. Now, what exactly happened next was, and still is heavily disputed. Both sides met in a small valley and claimed that the other fired the first shot. Washington insisted that the French spotted them as they were approaching an open fire, while the French maintained that Washington's men ambushed them in the early hours of the morning. Regardless of which side is to be believed, the British were easily able to overpower the smaller French force, and in the end, 10 French soldiers were killed, with the rest being captured. Joseph Coulon de Jumonville was the leader of the French party and among the captured. Washington honorably extended to him the customary courtesies that were afforded to military officers at the time and began trying to speak with Jumonville with the aid of a translator. Suddenly, without warning, Tanner Harrison approached Jumonville from behind and buried his tomahawk deep into the unsuspecting man's head. His exact reasons for doing this, like so many other things involved in this short altercation, were never made clear. It's believed that the French had captured him as a child and sold him into slavery, but Tanner Harrison also claimed that the French had boiled his father alive and eaten him. That last part in particular does sound a bit hard to believe, but knowing how terrible conditions can be for those living under the occupation of another nation, it's certainly also just not outside the realm of possibility. Washington parted ways with Tanner Harrison and returned back to Fort Necessity, where he continued to wait for reinforcements as well as retaliation from the French. And both would arrive very shortly. Back at Fort Duquesne, Captain Louis Coulon de Villiers, half-brother of the slain Jumonville, learns of the group's defeat and vowed to exact revenge for his fallen brother. The fort's new commander, Claude-Pierre Picardy de Contrecoeur, ordered Coulon de Villiers to attack Fort Necessity with a force of 600 men. They left and along the way gathered another 100 Native Americans to aid in the assault. While all of this was being put into motion, Washington received his reinforcements from Virginia and North Carolina, but still only had around 400 men in total. On the 3rd of July, Coulon de Villiers arrived outside Fort Necessity, and Washington ordered his men to find cover. Fighting ensued, and he quickly found himself unable to land many blows against the French, who fired upon his men from the nearby tree line. Finally, after heavy fighting and watching his men fall in number all around him, Washington ordered his remaining men to take shelter within the fort itself. As they quickly crammed into this small, rickety structure, the French continued to fire upon the fort without entering. Heavy rains set in and soiled the fort's gunpowder reserves and soaked the men to the bone. Despite Washington's orders not to, they broke into the alcohol reserves and began drinking as they awaited their deaths. All seemed to be lost for the young leader until all at once the firing stopped and a voice called out to them, asking for a parley. Washington, who saw a few other options, agreed and sent men to speak with the French commander. They quickly returned with a letter detailing the terms of surrender. Washington and his men would be allowed to leave with their military honor intact and flying the British flag so long as he agreed to peacefully surrender and vacate Port Necessity. Now, remember when I said at the beginning of this video that Washington would sign a document admitting to the assassination of a French official? Well, this is that document. Buried deep within the terms of surrender was a single line that took responsibility for the slaying of Ambassador Jumonville, who the French insisted was not on his way to attack the fort, but instead negotiate peace. After this revelation, Washington later believed that he may have been deceived by his once ally, the half-king, who was attempting to escalate tensions between the British and the French for his own tribe's benefit. Nobody knows for sure. The truth is just lost to history. Washington and his troops returned home, expecting the worst, but to their surprise, Washington was not blamed for the defeat. Governor Dinwiddie instead blamed it on a lack of troops and poor support from other forces. He believed that the young major had done everything in his power, but was simply overwhelmed by the French's numbers. In his journal, Washington wrote a detailed account of the events that had transpired, which was soon published in both Virginia and London. Eventually, it was reprinted in newspapers all across Britain and America, earning him a positive reputation and garnering him praise for bravery while in the face of certain defeat. However, Washington was not satisfied with his performance. He resigned from his position shortly after. In France, Washington was becoming famous for a different reason. They believed him to be a dishonorable failure and used his signed confession to drum up support for a war that may have already begun without anyone even realizing it. Around this time, French regulars and their Native American allies had begun pushing into British territory, and many colonists could already see the writing on the wall. War with France was inevitable. Seeing as it would take quite some time for reinforcements to arrive from overseas, many believed that something needed to be done locally within the colonies to prevent this disaster. It was because of this need that representatives from 7 of the 13 original colonies met in Albany to discuss what would later be known as the Albany Plan of Union. The man who formed this plan was yet another familiar name in American history, Benjamin Franklin. Franklin knew that if the colonies did not stand together, they would most likely be crushed by the more united French forces, and to stress this, he created the famous join or die illustration. In it, Franklin depicted a snake having been cut into 8 pieces, with each piece labeled with the initials of one of the British colonies or regions. Franklin's solution was to establish a unified government for the 13 colonies that would have the power to organize and coordinate a united continental army that would be paid for by taxes collected from colonial citizens. It was sensible. But as history tells us time and time again, people are often not. The proposal was met with mixed reactions, was ultimately rejected. The colonies were simply not ready to unify. They had no real military alliances, no sense of shared identity, and very few of their goals aligned. But the largest issue was that most representatives did not like the idea of taxes being collected from a centralized colonial government. If anyone in Britain had been paying attention, they might have realized that Americans really don't like paying taxes, and it might have saved them a few headaches a bit down the line. Finally, after almost a full year of waiting, British forces arrived on the coast of North America under the command of General Edward Braddock. Braddock had been sent with 2 regiments to lead a Virginian force to secure the Ohio country. His plan was to march roughly 100 miles across the Allegheny Mountains to launch an attack against the same French fort that Washington had failed to capture a year earlier, Fort Duquesne. In conjunction with this, Massachusetts Governor William Shirley was ordered to oversee the fortification of British Fort Oswego before attacking the French Fort Niagara. Similar attacks were planned on Forts Frederick by Sir William Johnson and Fort Beausejour by Lieutenant Colonel Robert Monckton. General Braddock himself was well respected and a very traditional fighter. He believed strongly in the idea of honorable warfare and adhered strictly to the rules of combat. In his opinion, wars were better fought out in the open and in a straight line, a tactic that worked well in the open plains on which European battles were often fought. Many of his advisors, including our good old buddy George Washington, who had volunteered to be Braddock's assistant during the journey, tried to warn the general that the Native Americans had been teaching their style of guerrilla warfare to the French and that he should expect them to use it. Braddock refused to listen, as he didn't believe that the French would be willing to stoop to such a level. On May the 29th, 1755, Braddock and his force of approximately 2,200 troops set out from Fort Cumberland, and on July the 9th, after over a month of rough travel, they arrived within 10 miles of their target. As they approached, Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Gage spotted the French in the trees and ordered his men to open fire. Their opening volleys succeeded in killing French Captain Bugeaud, but that would be one of the few British accomplishments that day. Just as Washington had predicted, the Native Americans had been lying in wait and had surrounded them. Around 900 French troops and Indian fighters leapt from the bushes and pivoted out from behind trees to launch arrows and fire bullets at Braddock's neatly organized line of troops. Even after seeing this, Braddock refused to allow his men to break formation, but the Virginians, who were not trained to stand their ground under fire the way the British regulars were, fled into the woods and attempted to take cover. Many of them were mistaken for enemy fighters and killed by their own men. Within a single hour of fighting, General Braddock had been shot, and Washington once again found himself leading a group of men to assault Fort Duquesne. But as the battle raged on, he realized that his men were completely beaten, and he began organizing a tactical retreat. This was a crushing defeat. Over 500 British men had been killed and hundreds more had been captured. The French casualties were a fraction of that. As they retreated back through the mountains, the Redcoats were constantly harassed by Native Americans who followed closely behind, raiding and looting the soldiers the entire way. For his bravery, Washington was dubbed the hero of the Monongahela. However, this was of little consolation, as Braddock's army, whom the Colonials had been waiting for so long, was now just a wounded fraction of its former self. On the 18th of May, 1756, Britain formally declared war on France, and as the various European powers began to take sides, they passed several acts in preparation for wars all across the globe. These acts called for the recruitment of new infantries and navies, as well as allowed for the looting of captured French ships. Back in America, Governor William Shirley had temporarily taken command following the death of General Braddock, but his plans to take Fort Niagara had failed. In fact, everything that had been planned earlier that year had failed, save for the taking of Fort Beausejour by Colonel Robert Monckton. In July, General John Campbell, Earl of Loudon, replaced William Shirley and assumed control of all British forces in North America. He proved to be an unpopular leader among the colonials, as he temporarily closed all British ports to prevent them from trading with enemy merchants. By September, Lord Loudon began preparing a plan of attack against the French. He intended to draw their focus away from the Ohio country by threatening Quebec, the capital city of New France, from the north. He knew that if he simply held his defensive positions along the frontier, he would eventually be able to force the French to pull their forces from around the Great Lakes. At that time, Loudon would advance his own troops and capture the weakened forts, effectively securing the entire Ohio country and severing New France's supply lines from the south. The plan was not a bad one. It could have worked. The entire war itself could have ended very soon after. However, because of the political turmoil that surrounded the larger 7 Years' War in Europe, he did not receive approval for his plan until the following year. That meant for over 6 months, Lord Loudon was forced to sit on his hands and wait while the French continued to push eastward. During this time, he worked with the provincial governors of the 13 colonies to bolster their defenses along the frontier, but they continued to suffer heavy losses. When a reply finally arrived, Loudon found that his plan had been heavily altered. Now, instead of attacking New France's capital, he was to launch a coastal attack against Louisbourg using a squadron of ships under the command of Rear Admiral Francis Holborn. During the confusion and reorganization, the French caught wind of this plan, and by April had sent reinforcements of their own from nearby ports to aid in Louisbourg's defense. Now, seeing as both sides had amassed great naval fleets, the stage was set for a truly epic battle, but unfortunately for the British, a number of setbacks would cause severe issues for them. An outbreak of typhus caused much of Holborn's fleet to be ported, and as a result he was forced to sail with a much smaller armada than he'd originally planned. Later, while en route, the weather began to sour, and on the 24th of September he was caught in a hurricane-level storm that severely damaged the remainder of his fleet, thus making the attack impossible. He and Lord Loudon returned to Britain the following year. Throughout the next 2 years, French forces, along with their North American allies, continued to win significant victories all across the Ohio and Great Lakes area. Most of this was due to General Louis-Joseph de Montcalm, who, upon his arrival in May of 1756, began setting his sights on several key British forts in the area. After quickly assessing the defenses of Fort Colonial, located on Lake Champlain, Montcalm led a force of roughly 3,000 troops to mount an assault against Fort Oswego, which was under the command of British Colonel James Mercer. On August the 11th, Montcalm's men arrived within a mile of the smaller nearby Fort Ontario and began entrenching themselves. After 2 days of exchanging gun and cannon fire, Mercer's men abandoned their positions and fled to the much larger Fort Oswego, Montcalm's primary target. From his newly captured position, Montcalm ordered the bombardment of Fort Oswego's exposed eastern side, and by the next morning, he had succeeded in collapsing its stone wall and killing Colonel Mercer. 1,700 prisoners, including 80 officers, were taken, as well as thousands of pounds of gunpowder and food provisions. Before returning to Montreal, Montcalm ordered the fort to be destroyed. The following year, he managed to score yet another major victory at the siege of Fort William Henry. The fort, which had been left poorly defended after Lord Loudon had pulled a significant number of troops to man his failed assault on Louisbourg, was occupied by Lieutenant Colonel George Monroe. Despite being outnumbered nearly 3-1, Monroe's men put up a hearty defense. However, after several days of heavy bombardments, they had no choice but to surrender. These victories, and others like them, allowed the French to continue their march across the Ohio country, raiding and capturing English settlers as they went. Up until this point, British leaders in Europe were still failing to take the war in North America seriously. For years, their focus had been locked on the larger 7 Years' War, and most representatives had adopted a let America deal with America's problems sort of mentality. This lack of support allowed the French to secure victory after victory against British colonials, and by 1758, they had arrived within 60 miles of Philadelphia. things were beginning to look hopeless. However, all of that changed with the arrival of William Pitt. Pitt was a British politician who understood that the war in Europe was deeply connected to the struggles in North America. He believed that no real victory could be achieved at home without first addressing the issues abroad. To do this, Pitt secured funding from the British Parliament, promising to provide a total reimbursement to the colonies for the expenses they had accrued while fighting on Britain's behalf. He also funded an expansion of the British Royal Navy, which allowed them to dominate the seas. These ships captured and sank any French military supply or transport ship that they believed to be sailing toward New France. After this, he appointed new military talent that he believed could change the course of the war. At the same time that Britain was re-strategizing, France began facing major issues that would lose them the support of many crucial allies. A massive financial crisis had left them on the verge of bankruptcy, which was inhibiting their ability to wage war. Furthermore, troops were suffering from famine resulting from poor food yields the prior year, as well as Pitt's new blockades, which were now blocking all incoming food and supply shipments. The result was a major turn in favour of the British, and in July of 1758, Major General Geoffrey Amherst finally succeeded in the taking of Louisbourg, something that Lord Loudon and Admiral Hobon had failed to do 3 years prior. One notable French victory during this time period was the defense of Fort Colonial by General Montcalm. Here, he and his men managed to defend their positions against the much larger British force under the command of Major General Adams Abercrombie. However, this was less the result of Montcalm's planning, as it was a series of unfortunate failures and tactical miscalculations on the part of the British. While it was seen as a major victory at the time, it would mean very little overall, as the fort would be captured the following year after being abandoned by its garrison. A month later, British Lieutenant Colonel John Bradstreet forced the surrender of Fort Frontenac, a crucial communications and supply hub that connected Montreal and Quebec City to other French territories. In November of that same year, Fort Duquesne, the pesky fort which had kick-started this entire conflict, was abandoned by the French after learning that Brigadier General John Forbes was leading a force of 6,000 to lay siege. To better handle the logistics of moving such a large number of troops through the extremely difficult terrain, Forbes and his men constructed a road all the way from Carlisle to Fort Duquesne, a road that is still known as the Forbes Road. After this, Fort Duquesne was renamed Pittsburgh and used as a launching point for the Siege of Quebec, which occurred the following year in 1759. During this battle, the British and French forces met on a plateau just outside the walls of Quebec City in an encounter known as the Battle of the Plains of Abraham. During the fighting, both commanders, British General James Wolfe and French General Louis-Joseph Montcalm, were mortally wounded. While the battle was occurring outside the city, the French abandoned it, and on September 13th, British victory was declared. In July 1760, Geoffrey Amherst launched a three-pronged attack against the last major French holdout, Montreal. Troops from Lake Ontario, Quebec, and Fort Crown Point all converged on the city, and on the 8th of September, the French agreed to an unconditional surrender. A week later, British flags were raised over Detroit. Small skirmishes would continue across the higher country and in parts of British-controlled New France, but the war in North America was effectively over. In Europe, the fighting raged for 2 more full years, until finally, on the 10th of February 1763, the Treaty of Paris was signed. In it, France ceded all of their territories in North America to Britain, with the exception of New Orleans, which was given to Spain. For now, a fragile peace had once again been achieved, but the effects that the French and Indian War had on the Americas cannot be understated. Not only had the French lost a majority of their holdings in the New World and around the globe, but Britain had lost something arguably even more important: the support of their colonies. The casual attitude that had been displayed by leaders in Britain during the early stages of the war had left a deep resentment in the hearts of many British colonials. Benjamin Franklin's proposal for unity during the Albany meeting may have failed at the time, but it would bear a striking resemblance to the one that would be passed at the First Continental Congress just a few short decades later. Britain would pour gasoline on the fire by attempting to recoup a portion of its wartime losses through taxation of their colonies, but as we all know, those taxes weren't exactly very well received. Outrage led to calls for representation, acts of rebellion, and eventually, after much work from George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, and many other veterans of the French and Indian War, revolution.